Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to change out the rear shock oil on your dirt bike. This shock came off a 2019 CRF 250RX and we need to get our oil changed out on this. Now keep in mind that this video is just about changing your shock oil out as periodic maintenance. If you have a leaky shock seal, we do have videos to help guide you through that process to get that seal replaced. Now you want to change this oil out anytime you're changing your fork oil. And the reason for that is this oil breaks down over time and it doesn't perform as well as fresh oil would. So if you want to get the best performance out of your shock, you want to get that freshened up periodically. And this process will be similar for most dirt bikes, but you always want to refer to your model-specific service manual for more information and specs. Now to get this job done, we have our preload adjusting tool, digital air pump, we have a pen and paper to write things down, we have safety glasses, rags, rubber gloves, a drain pan, and then for chemicals, we have suspension clean and some shock oil. Now before we take anything apart, we want to write down a few things about this shock. So we want to measure the spring length. That way we can get our preload back to its original position. And then we want to record where the low speed clickers are at. So what we're going to do is we'll turn them all the way clockwise till they lightly seat, count those clicks and write them down. And then we'll back those adjusters all the way off, and that's going to help with the bleeding process later on. Once we've taken our measurements, we're going to put this shock into the vise. We're actually using soft jaws, and you want to make sure you're doing that, or at the minimum, you can use a couple blocks of wood to clamp that in place. And we're going to loosen this lock ring. So once that's loose, we're going to back it all the way off. We want to back the spring tension all the way off as well. Now another thing I want to point out is that we started with a clean shock, and you want to do the same thing, make sure this thing's all cleaned up, but at the same time, if you have a hard time moving these ring adjusters, then you can spray a little bit of penetrating oil on there just to help free things up. So next thing, we have our spring seat right here, and we need to get that away. There's a snap ring or a circlip right behind it that holds it in place. We need to help get that away from there. So it helps to use a plastic mallet to kind of hit that away. And then what we're going to do is, since our preload adjuster, it only moves a small amount, some shocks, you have enough adjustment on there, you can back the spring way off and have easy access to that circlip. But ours, we're actually going to have to pull down just a little bit on the shock spring to remove that clip. I'm just using a pick to work this clip off. And as I take everything apart, I'm just going to lay out a rag, lay everything out in order. So we have the spring seat, and we'll take the spring off. Our spring is directional. One end has a bigger inside diameter than the other end. So we'll take note of how that goes back on. And then after that, what we're going to do, I'm going to flip this around just to show you guys. We have a Schrader valve on our bladder. And what we need to do is release that pressure. I'm going to flip this shock back around. So right here we have our compression adjuster, and we're actually going to remove this piece from the shock body, and then we're going to take this over our drain pan and remove it all the way. We'll drain the oil out, and we'll use the shock shaft to help pump the oil out. So if you notice some really dirty oil coming out of this, it might be helpful to fill the shock body up with some fresh oil and then dump it out again to kind of flush some of that bad stuff out of there. But for now, what we're gonna do is put this back into the vise. And when we clamp this down, you wanna be really soft on this shock body. You don't wanna damage it. And I'm gonna extend this shock shaft a little bit. So we're gonna lightly clamp this into place. And we're gonna start bleeding the fresh oil into the shock body. So what I'm doing now, I filled this up as far as I can with shock fluid, and I'm gonna put the drain pan underneath it because you're probably gonna lose just a little bit of shock fluid out of this as you go through the bleeding process. And when you do this, it's really easy to make a mess. So what I'm gonna do, especially for the few initial bleeding strokes, I'm gonna cover this up with my hand and just leave it cracked a little bit so it can still breathe. And we'll move the shock shaft up and down. And that's gonna help work any air that's trapped in there out. And as you go through the process, you wanna keep topping off this fluid and keep the fluid level all the way up. So once you get to the point where it's pretty well bled, you can stick a little bit closer to the bottom and just kind of watch the bubbles until there's no more bubbles coming out. And one thing that can help is you can cover this up and hit it with a dead blow hammer. That's gonna help open up that shim stack and get any bubbles that are in that as well, help them come to the top. And all of these steps, you can repeat them as many times as you need until you get all those bubbles out of there. Now once you have all of the air bubbles out of the shock body, we're gonna top this off and we're gonna do a couple of final things to get it bled all the way. So once that's topped off, I'm going to remove the shock body from the vise. I'm gonna cover this opening up with my hand and I'm gonna tip the shock body up. And then I'm also gonna tip it on its sides just to help any air come to the top. So once you've done that, you can lay it horizontal again. We'll set this back into our vise. And again, we're just barely clamping down on this body, just enough to hold it in place. And then what I'm gonna do now, I have my ratio right filled up with some shock fluid. And at this point, we wanna get new O-rings installed onto our compression assembly. Now I'm gonna remove these old O-rings. You can find the new O-rings under the OEM diagram on our website. And while we have the compression adjuster out, we're gonna spray it off with some cleaner. Now if you see any visible damage, you wanna get this replaced. Ours is looking pretty good though. I'm gonna take our shock fluid, I'm gonna fill this cap up with some shock oil. And then we're gonna use that to coat our new O-rings with some fresh oil. So at this point, I'm actually gonna take this compression assembly, I'm just gonna drop it down into the shock oil in the ratio right, and it's just gonna help bleed any air out of there. And the goal here is to eliminate having any air in the shock body. So at this point, we can fill this bladder with 7.1 PSI of pressure. And what that's gonna do, it's gonna let the bladder take its normal shape. And then we can install our compression adjuster. And while we do this, it's gonna push out some of the fluid from the shock body. And if there's any air trapped in here, it's gonna help push that out as well. So just make sure you have your drain pan underneath while you do this. So now that we have that done, we're gonna remove this pump from the bladder. And your shock oil, it should be to the top of this opening. If it's not, then you've got to check what's going on. Make sure it's all the way topped up. And what we're going to do is put this compression adjuster into place, and we're going to torque it down to 22 foot-pounds. But for your machine, you want to check your model-specific service manual. Another style of shock you might run into is the KYB with the bleeder at the top. Now, there's two ways to change this fluid. You can take this whole thing apart as if you're going to replace the seal head, or you can bleed it up like we just showed you. Now, when you do this, what we're going to do is, before we pump up this bladder, we'll put the compression adjuster in place. Then we're going to pump it up to 7 pounds. Once we've done that, we can crack this bleeder loose. I'm actually going to back it out all the way and just wait for any bubbles to come out and then tighten it back down. So we did have just a tiny bit of air at the top. And then I went ahead, put the screw back in, and we'll tighten it down. So as you can see, we've got a pretty good mess going on here. What I'm going to do now is clean up all the shock oil from the shock body. So I'll wipe it down with a rag and use that suspension cleaner on it. All right, now that we've got the shock cleaned up, what we're going to do is release this pressure from that bladder. And then we're going to fill this up with nitrogen. You can find the nitrogen pressure in your service manual, and obviously most of you won't have a nitrogen tank. So what you can do is take this shock down to your local motorcycle shop and have them fill it up. It'll probably be a small fee. And what we want to do, we want to fill this up with nitrogen before we put the spring on, and that way we can compress it and make sure the shock shaft extends all the way smoothly. If it doesn't, then we know we have a problem in there and need to get it taken care of. So we'll go ahead and fill this up. Once you have the shock filled with nitrogen, you can compress the shock shaft. You let it extend all the way. What you're looking for is smooth action all the way up and that it extends all the way on its own. If it doesn't, or if it kind of skips in one spot, then you know you have air in the system and it needs to be rebled. All right, so now that we know we're good, I'm gonna mount this back up in the vise. We're gonna reinstall the spring. Again, paying attention to which orientation we took it off in. Install the spring seat and the retaining clip. Once all that's in place, we'll tighten down these locking rings, and keep in mind we took that measurement. We'll just set it to the same measurement and then tighten down the lock ring right on that. You can do the lock ring when the shock's actually back on the bike, but just for convenience, we're gonna do it right now. All right, the last things we need to do is set our compression and rebound adjusters back to their original positions. We'll put the shock back on the bike, and then we're ready to go ride. So if you need any shock oil, or maybe you had a blown seal, we do have seal heads available on our website, so be sure to check that out and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.